This summary explores Gateway to Freedom, the hidden history of the Underground Railroad, a book that tells the harrowing story of enslaved Black people escaping to freedom in the period between American independence and the Civil War, a chapter of history that would profoundly shape the nation's future. When you hear Underground Railroad, don't picture an actual train line. It was, in fact, a secret network of routes and safe houses established by American abolitionists in the early to mid-19th century to help enslaved people escape. Through this network, they were guided to the free states in the North, and even as far as Canada and Mexico, to begin new lives. Why did such a critical rescue operation have to be conducted in secret? Because at the time, helping enslaved people escape was a serious federal crime. They were legally considered the private property of plantation owners, and this status was protected by federal law. It's estimated that from the early 1800s to the 1850s, between 1,000 and 5,000 enslaved people successfully escaped via the Underground Railroad each year. Over several decades, the total number of people who broke free from bondage exceeded 100,000. The Underground Railroad is therefore not only a pivotal chapter in American history, but also a deeply ingrained memory for African Americans tracing their ancestral past. Despite its importance, this history is surprisingly unfamiliar to many Americans today. Official accounts have long been vague on the subject. On one hand, it touches upon the politically sensitive nerve of the North-South divide. On the other, both pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions have historically exaggerated and distorted this secret history, fueling later misconceptions. This began to change with the publication of this book in 2015. The author, Eric Foner, a renowned authority on American history, used a recently discovered manuscript from an abolitionist to reconstruct a long-buried chapter of the Underground Railroad. With his work, the details of this bloody and tear-stained period of Black American history finally came into focus, filling in many missing pieces of the puzzle. Now, with that background established, I will tell the story of the Underground Railroad in 3 parts. First, what was the social landscape for enslaved Black people in America at that time? Second, how does the discovery of a single manuscript give us a glimpse into the true nature of the Underground Railroad? Third, what profound impact did this movement have on the Civil War and the course of American history? Let's begin with the first point: the living conditions of enslaved Black people in the 19th century. Only by understanding their environment can we grasp why they were willing to risk everything to escape. By the early 19th century, the United States had won its independence from Britain, established a constitution, and was gradually becoming a democratic nation. The country's development at the time can be viewed along 2 axes: east to west and north to south. From east to west, the nation, which began as just 13 states on the eastern seaboard, was expanding. Countless Americans pushed westward from the Atlantic coast, crossing the Appalachian Mountains and steadily encroaching on the lands of Native Americans. It took decades for the United States to stretch its borders from the Atlantic to the Pacific. From north to south, 2 vastly different economic models emerged. The North, which built its fortune on maritime trade, established modern industry and finance, rapidly industrializing to become a world power. The South, however, was dominated by a cotton plantation economy, and the institution of slavery was the cornerstone of this economic model. Why was this the case? The American South had a harsh climate where infectious diseases were rampant. Countless attempts to cultivate the land failed due to extremely high mortality rates. Only Africans, who had greater resistance to tropical diseases, could survive the conditions. Ultimately, the labor force on southern plantations consisted almost entirely of enslaved Black people. The slave trade existed even before Europeans arrived in the New World, and their arrival only accelerated it. From the landing of the Mayflower to the early 19th century, slavery had been in operation in the Americas for nearly 200 years, resulting in a population of millions of enslaved people, most of whom were concentrated in the slave states of the South. The brutal labor and tragic plight of these individuals were no secret. Where there is oppression, there is resistance. Wherever slavery existed, there were enslaved people running toward freedom. In the late 18th century, European thinkers and social activists began calling for the abolition of the slave trade, arguing it was inhumane and contrary to the progress of civilization. In 1806, The British Parliament passed legislation making it the first major power to ban the slave trade. The following year, the U.S. Congress also passed a law prohibiting the importation of slaves. But a law is one thing, and its enforcement is another. The South's immense demand for slave labor rendered the ban virtually meaningless, and the smuggling of enslaved people continued unabated. In 1832, the Virginia legislature held a 2-week-long debate on abolishing slavery. Many forward-thinking individuals argued for abolition, but their greatest fear was what to do with a large population of free black citizens, as enslaved people already outnumbered whites in many southern states. At the time, Southern intellectuals focused more on technical questions than moral ones. Radical proposals suggested deporting all black people, including those already free. More moderate plans involved gradually sending enslaved people away to reduce the black population before formally abolishing slavery. But even the moderate approach was fraught with difficulty. The debate raged on for decades with no resolution, while the suffering of enslaved people continued day after day. Many could not wait. They resisted instinctively, some by slowing their work, others by running away. Some white Americans also began to help them in secret. Ultimately, the issue of slavery was not resolved by debate, but by actions that forced institutional change and ignited a brutal civil war. That concludes the first part. The horrific living conditions for enslaved black people and a shifting international opinion set the stage for the rise of the Underground Railroad. Next, we'll look at how the Underground Railroad actually worked. As we mentioned, the Underground Railroad was a social network that helped enslaved people escape to free states. It consisted of countless secret routes and the people who traveled them. The railroad had no fixed start or end point. Even reaching the north did not guarantee safety. But the fugitives held on to a single belief: follow the path north. The city of Cincinnati, Ohio, was once a major hub in the Underground Railroad network. For many enslaved people, reaching Cincinnati meant seeing a glimmer of hope for freedom. Historically, escapes occurred from the very beginning of slavery. By the late 18th century, the numbers began to grow, and the term Underground Railroad emerged. In the early 19th century, as more people got involved, its efficiency increased, peaking in the 1850s. Despite the movement's scale, very little written documentation was left behind. There are two main reasons for this. First, although escaping slaves received a great deal of help, their rescuers rarely revealed their true identities. The fugitives themselves often had low levels of literacy, and even if they wanted to record their stories, they needed someone to write for them, a process that inevitably led to embellishment and distortion. Second, many materials were intentionally destroyed by the participants themselves. Helping enslaved people escape was incredibly risky. Before 1850, law enforcement in many northern states sympathized with southern plantation owners and would actively capture fugitives. In 1850, the highly controversial Fugitive Slave Act was passed, explicitly making it a federal responsibility to assist slaveholders in capturing runaways and making it a felony to aid them. Despite the scarcity of historical records, scholars never gave up. In 1898, history professor Wilbur Siebert published a general history of the subject, depicting a highly organized and orderly underground network. He even claimed to have confirmed the names of over 3,000 conductors. However, in the 1960s, scholar Larry Guerra challenged this view in his book The Liberty Line. He argued that Siebert had accepted the exaggerated claims of abolitionists and that the real Underground Railroad was a dynamic, loose network with constantly changing routes and personnel. Interestingly, the myth of the Underground Railroad was co-created by both abolitionists and pro-slavery factions. The former exaggerated the contributions of Northerners, while the latter sensationalized the network's organization to portray it as a Northern conspiracy. It was at this point that a manuscript accidentally discovered by this book's author, Eric Foner, not only confirmed Guerra's view but also offered a new perspective for understanding the Underground Railroad. The manuscript was written by Sidney Howard Gay, a well-educated abolitionist who was a fervent believer in freedom and equality. He was the editor of an anti-slavery newspaper in New York, but his more important, secret role was as a leader of the Underground Railroad in the city. At the time, New York was a major international port whose economic lifeline was deeply intertwined with Southern slave labor. Therefore, unlike in other northern cities, New York officials and police actively captured fugitive slaves. This made Gay's rescue work exceptionally dangerous. The book cites an example from Boston. In 1854, an escaped slave named Anthony Burns was captured after reaching the city, and a federal order was issued for his return. Citizens protested fiercely, even attempting to storm the courthouse, but the rescue failed. To transport this one unfortunate man, the federal government deployed a force of 1,500 soldiers. That day, shops across Boston closed, windows were draped in black cloth, and citizens silently watched as the army marched Burns away. One can only imagine how difficult Gay's work was in a city like New York. He was responsible for receiving fugitives who had escaped from the South to New York and then sending them on to the greater safety of New England and Canada. Between 1855 and 1856, Gay assisted at least 214 fugitives passing through the city. During these rescues, Gay meticulously recorded each person's name, origin, reason for escaping, and route. This precious material gives us a glimpse into the long and perilous journey to freedom. In an era of primitive transportation, traveling from the south to the north took months, and people had to resort to all kinds of extreme measures to evade capture. Take Henry Box Brown, for example. After his wife and children were sold away, he was determined to protest slavery with his actions. He had himself packed into a wooden crate labeled dry goods, this side up with a bladder of water and a few biscuits, and mailed himself to Philadelphia. After a 24-hour, 250-mile journey, several abolitionists in Philadelphia opened the crate and were astonished to see Brown climb out. The image of Henry Box Brown became one of the most famous pieces of propaganda in the abolitionist movement. That concludes the second part. Through Sidney Howard Gay's manuscript, we learn that the Underground Railroad was not a fixed, tightly organized system, but it did help countless black people who yearned for freedom. Now let's turn to our third point, the impact of the Underground Railroad on American history. First, the Underground Railroad movement did not directly shake the economic foundations of slavery in the South. Although tens of thousands escaped, this was a small fraction of the total enslaved population of 4 million. So why is it still such a significant event in American history? Because it highlighted the brutality of slavery, intensified the national debate, and ultimately gave rise to the abolitionist movement. Countless escaped slaves publicly shared their experiences in the North, testifying to the inhumanity of the slave system. Their autobiographies became a popular literary genre of the time and profoundly changed public perception of slavery. Southern plantation owners fought back aggressively, pushing Congress to pass the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law stipulated that all American citizens were obligated to assist in the capture of fugitive slaves. This meant that for an escaped slave, there was no safe place left in the entire United States. At the same time, international pressure embarrassed the slaveholders. Great Britain, which had long since abolished slavery, continually applied pressure, and neighboring Mexico refused to extradite enslaved people who had escaped into its territory. These political and moral debates eventually escalated into war. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Like many Northerners, he faced a moral and legal dilemma. On one hand, he did not want the nation to split apart and had to respect the Constitution that protected slavery on the other. The belief that all men are created equal stood in stark contrast to reality. This clash of values inevitably threatened the fundamental interests of Southern plantation owners. In a sense, the American Civil War was an ideological revolution that took place in the minds of Lincoln and all Americans. The active resistance of enslaved people yearning for freedom was a powerful force driving this war. At the outset of the Civil War, Lincoln's primary goal was to prevent secession, not to free the slaves. But during the war, a group of brave fugitives risked their lives to join the Union Army and had a significant impact on the conflict. This led Lincoln and other politicians to reconsider the war's objectives. In 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. In 1864, the Fugitive Slave Act was repealed. In 1866, during the Reconstruction era, the Civil Rights Act guaranteed basic rights for the newly freed black population. The history of the Underground Railroad is a story of Americans helping black people fight for their rights. It offers us several insights. First, the rights we often take for granted are not inherent, they must be won through words and actions. Second, the road to freedom is never smooth, it is fraught with obstacles and the risk of regression. Third, the attainment of civil rights is incredibly difficult. It involved not only the struggle of Black people themselves, but also the quiet dedication of white abolitionists. Now, let's review the main points of our discussion. In Gateway to Freedom, Eric Foner uncovers the long-obscured history of the Underground Railroad. First, we reviewed the social conditions of 19th-century America to understand the reality for enslaved people and the differing views on slavery in the North and South. Second, through Sidney Howard Gay's manuscript, we learned about the true operational nature of this social network. Finally, we explored how the Underground Railroad movement intensified social conflicts and ultimately influenced the American Civil War and the course of history. Gateway to Freedom helps us understand not only America's past but also its present. Black people endured a long struggle to escape bondage. The Underground Railroad operated for decades, eventually becoming a catalyst for social change. The deep divisions between North and South erupted into a brutal civil war, and only after the war were the rights of Black people partially realized. The attainment of these rights was incredibly precious and deserves to be cherished. That is all for this summary. Congratulations on finishing another book.